The barbed wire fence post snapped clean through under the weight of the half-ton steer, and Jane Sullivan knew she had about 3 seconds before 200 head of cattle decided freedom looked better than her north pasture. She threw herself against the gap, arms spread wide, voice tearing from her throat in a sound that was half command and half prayer, while splinters from the broken post dug into her palms through her worn leather gloves. The lead steer, a massive longhorn she had named Brutus for his temperament, stopped just short of trampling her into the dust. His breath came hot against her face as he snorted, considering his options. Behind him, the rest of the herd milled and stamped, sensing the possibility of escape. Jane held her ground, though her legs trembled and her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. This was her life now. Had been for 7 years since Thomas died and left her this ranch, this land, this impossible dream that sometimes felt more like a curse. "Back," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Back, you stubborn devil." Brutus tossed his head, those massive horns catching the late afternoon sun of the Texas sky. But he took 1 step backward, then another. The herd followed his lead as they always did, and Jane felt the familiar rush of relief mixed with exhaustion that came with every small victory. She had bought herself maybe an hour before that fence needed to be fixed properly, before dark fell across her land and brought with it all the dangers that darkness held in Del Rio, Texas, in the year of 1884. She was 26 years old and felt 50 most days. The ranch stretched out around her, 3,000 acres of stubborn land that fought her every step of the way. Thomas had bought it with dreams in his eyes and promises on his lips, had built the house with his own hands, had strung the first fences and broken the first horses. Then a rattlesnake had bitten him while he was checking the south water tank, and he had been dead before the sun set. Jane had been 19, married less than a year, and suddenly alone with a half-built ranch and a herd of cattle that needed tending. Everyone had expected her to sell. Her father had written from St. Louis begging her to come home. The bank had offered to take the land off her hands, though for far less than it was worth. The neighboring ranchers had circled like vultures, making lowball offers and patronizing comments about how hard ranch work was for a woman alone. She had told them all no, had taught herself to rope and brand, to set fence posts and treat hoof rot, to shoot straight and ride hard, had spent 7 years proving to everyone, including herself, that Jane Sullivan could do what needed doing. But God, she was tired. The sun was setting in earnest now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if Jane had the energy to appreciate them. She walked back to the barn, her boots kicking up dust with each step, and gathered what she needed to fix the fence. Post, hammer, nails, fresh wire. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory built from years of repetition. She loaded everything into the small wagon, hitched up her mare Belle, and headed back out to the pasture. The work was hard and her shoulders ached by the time she finished setting the new post. The cattle watched her with their dark, liquid eyes, unconcerned now that the excitement was over. She strung the wire carefully, wrapping it tight, making sure every connection would hold. The last thing she needed was to wake up at dawn to find her herd scattered across 3 counties. Darkness had fully fallen by the time she made it back to the house. She tended to Belle first, brushing her down and making sure she had feed and water. The other horses nickered softly from their stalls, and she checked on each one, running her hands along their legs, feeling for heat or swelling, anything that might indicate injury or illness. This was her routine, the pattern of her days and nights. The animals first, always. Her own needs came last if there was time left at all. Inside the house, she lit the lamps and stoked the fire in the stove. The house was small, just 3 rooms and a loft, but it was solid. Thomas had built it to last. His presence lingered in every corner, in the careful joinery of the walls, in the wide hearth he had laid stone by stone. Sometimes she could almost feel him there, watching over her shoulder, proud of what she had managed to keep alive. Other times, she just felt alone. She heated water and made herself eat, though she had little appetite. Beans and cornbread, the same meal she had eaten for what felt like 1,000 nights. She was too tired to cook anything more elaborate, too worn down to care. After eating, she sat at the table and went over her accounts by lamplight, tallying up expenses and income, trying to figure out how she was going to make it through another year. The numbers were not good. They never were. The drought 2 years back had hit her hard, forcing her to sell off part of the herd at bad prices just to keep the rest alive. Last year's cattle drive had been plagued by problems, from stampedes to rustlers, and she had lost more than she could afford. This year needed to be better. It had to be better. But spring was coming, and with it the long drive north to the railhead at San Antonio, and Jane did not know if she had the strength left to do it alone. She had hired help before, seasonal workers who stayed for a few months before moving on. But she could not afford to keep anyone on permanently, could barely afford to feed herself most months. The ranch survived, but just barely. Always one disaster away from ruin. Jane closed the ledger and rubbed her eyes. She needed sleep. Dawn would come early, as it always did, and with it another day of endless work. She climbed the ladder to the loft where her bed waited, stripped off her dusty clothes, and collapsed onto the mattress. Sleep claimed her quickly, but it was not restful. She dreamed of broken fences and scattered cattle, of empty accounts and foreclosure notices, of being swallowed up by the land she had fought so hard to keep. Morning arrived gray and cold. Jane woke before sunrise and dressed quickly, layering against the chill. Spring in Texas could be unpredictable, warm one day and freezing the next. She made coffee and drank it black and bitter, letting the heat wake her up from the inside out. Then she was out the door, heading to the barn, beginning the cycle all over again. The cattle needed to be checked. The horses needed to be fed. The chickens needed their eggs collected. The water tanks needed to be inspected. Fence lines needed to be ridden. It was endless, an infinite loop of tasks that never stayed completed. She worked through the morning, her breath misting in the cold air, her hands growing numb despite her gloves. She was riding the southern fence line when she saw the rider approaching. Her hand went instinctively to the rifle in her saddle scabbard, then relaxed slightly as she recognized the horse. It was Tom Fletcher, who owned the spread to the east of hers. He was a decent enough man, though he had made it clear over the years that he thought she should have sold out long ago. "Morning, Jane," he called as he drew near. "Tom," she acknowledged, keeping her voice neutral. "Saw your smoke this morning, wanted to check in. You doing all right out here?" "Same as always." He shifted in his saddle, looking uncomfortable. Tom Fletcher was in his 50s, weathered by decades of sun and wind, and he had never quite figured out how to talk to her. Most men did not. They saw a woman doing man's work and did not know where to put her in their understanding of the world. "Look, Jane, I am going to be straight with you. I am putting together my crew for the drive north, and I am short on hands. Heard you might be in the same situation. I was thinking maybe we could combine our herds, split the costs, split the profits. Would be easier than trying to manage separate drives." Jane considered this. It was not the first time someone had made such an offer, and she knew it was practical. 2 small herds together would be safer, more efficient. But it also meant giving up control, trusting someone else with her livelihood. And in her experience, trust was a luxury she could not afford. "I appreciate the offer, Tom, but I will manage my own drive." "You cannot keep doing this alone, Jane. You are going to work yourself to death." "That is my choice to make." He sighed, shaking his head. Stubborn as your husband was, Thomas would not listen to reason either. Something sharp twisted in her chest at the mention of Thomas. She kept her face carefully blank. Was there anything else? No. No, I suppose not. Offer stands if you change your mind. She watched him ride away, then turned her horse back to the fence line. She did not have time for this, for conversations and offers and people telling her what she could not do. She had work. endless work, and no one to do it but herself. The days blurred together after that. Jane fell into the familiar rhythm of ranch life, the pattern that had sustained her for 7 years. Rise before dawn, work until dark, fall into bed exhausted. Check the cattle, mend the fences, tend the horses. Over and over, an endless cycle that left no room for anything else. No room for friends or family, for church socials or town dances. She went into Del Rio once a month for supplies, speaking to the shopkeepers and nothing more, then rode back out to her ranch and her isolation. But as March gave way to April, she could no longer avoid the truth. She needed to start preparing for the drive north, and she needed help to do it. Her herd had grown over the winter despite her struggles, which should have been good news but instead just meant more animals to manage. She needed at least 2 more riders, maybe 3, to safely move 200 head of cattle across 100 miles of Texas. She put the word out in town that she was hiring. The response was lukewarm at best. Most experienced cowboys did not want to work for a woman, especially one with a reputation for being difficult. The few who did apply were either too old or too young or too obviously incompetent. Jane turned them all away, frustration mounting with each passing day. She was in the barn, sorting tack and trying to figure out how she was going to manage this impossibility, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She stepped out into the sunlight, squinting against the glare, and saw a rider coming up the long drive to her house. He was a stranger, which in itself was not unusual. Drifters and cowboys passed through Del Rio regularly, looking for work or just passing through on their way to somewhere else. But something about the way this man sat his horse, the easy confidence in his posture, made her pay attention. He was tall. She could see that even mounted, with broad shoulders and the lean build of someone who made their living in the saddle. His hat was pulled low against the sun, shadowing his face, but she could see dark hair and what looked like several days' worth of beard. He rode a solid-looking buckskin gelding that moved well, responsive and well-trained. He stopped a respectful distance from the barn and dismounted. Now she could see his face, and she was struck by the directness of his gaze. His eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, and they assessed her with the same careful attention she was giving him. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name is Ethan Marshall. I heard in town you might be looking for hands for a cattle drive." His voice was deep and steady, with an accent that suggested he had spent time in multiple places, not Texas-born, but comfortable here nonetheless. "Might be," Jane said carefully. "Depends on what you know." "I know cattle, been working ranches and drives since I was 15, can rope, brand, break horses, handle just about anything that needs handling. I am good with a gun if trouble comes, but I am better at avoiding trouble in the first place." "Where have you worked?" "All over. Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. Spent the last 3 years on a ranch outside of Denver, but the owner died and his son sold the place. Figured I would head south for a while, see what Texas had to offer." Jane studied him, trying to decide if he was telling the truth. He looked capable enough, and she desperately needed the help. But hiring a stranger was always a risk, especially for a woman alone. "You know you would be working for a woman?" she asked bluntly. "Some men have a problem with that." Ethan shrugged. "I have a problem with dishonest people and lazy people. If you are neither of those things, we will get along fine." Despite herself, Jane felt a small smile tug at her lips. "I am not paying much. Food and $30 for the drive, plus a bonus if we get good prices." "That is fair." "You will sleep in the bunkhouse. It is small and it is not fancy, but it is dry and warm." "I have slept in worse." Jane hesitated a moment longer, then made her decision. She needed help, and this man seemed like he could provide it. "All right, you are hired. I am Jane Sullivan. This is my ranch. We leave for San Antonio in 3 weeks, which means we have a lot of work to do before then." Ethan nodded. "Yes, madam, just point me where you need me." She showed him the bunkhouse, which was indeed small and plain but serviceable. Then she gave him a tour of the ranch, pointing out the pastures and the water tanks, the barn and the corrals. He asked good questions, the kind that showed he actually knew what he was talking about, and she found herself relaxing slightly. Maybe this would work out. Maybe she had finally found someone who could actually help. They worked together for the rest of the day, and Jane was impressed despite herself. Ethan moved with the easy competence of someone who had been doing this work his entire life. He seemed to understand what needed doing without being told, and he worked steadily without complaint. When evening came and she called it quits for the day, he had accomplished more than she usually managed alone. "There is food up at the house," she said, suddenly feeling awkward. She had not shared a meal with anyone in longer than she could remember. "Nothing fancy, just stew, but you are welcome to it." "I appreciate that, madam." "It is Jane. Madam makes me feel old." He smiled, the expression transforming his face. "Then I appreciate it, Jane." They ate together in comfortable silence, and Jane found herself sneaking glances at him across the table. It had been so long since she had shared her space with another person, and she had forgotten what it was like. The house felt different with someone else in it. Warmer somehow, less empty. After dinner, Ethan thanked her and headed back to the bunkhouse. Jane cleaned up and sat at the table with her accounts, but she found it hard to concentrate. Her mind kept drifting to the man now living on her property, to his steady blue eyes and capable hands. She told herself firmly that this was just a business arrangement, that she had hired him to do a job and nothing more. She could not afford to think of him as anything other than an employee, but that night, she slept better than she had in months. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. With Ethan's help, Jane was able to accomplish tasks that had been languishing for months. They repaired fences and sorted cattle, shoed horses, and organized supplies. She managed to hire 2 more hands, younger men who were willing to work for low wages in exchange for the experience. With a crew of 4, the drive was actually possible. And through it all, Jane found herself increasingly aware of Ethan, the way he moved, the sound of his voice, the rare but genuine smiles he gave. He was unfailingly polite and professional, never crossing any lines. But there was something in the way he looked at her sometimes that made her heart beat faster. Something that suggested he saw her not just as his employer, but as a woman. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way. 7 years since Thomas died. 7 years since she had thought of herself as anything other than a rancher, a worker, a woman alone. She had buried that part of herself along with her husband, had told herself she did not need it, did not want it. But now, working alongside Ethan day after day, she felt something awakening inside her that she had thought was dead. They were working together in the corral one afternoon, breaking a young horse to saddle when he asked about Thomas. "Your husband," Ethan said, keeping his voice casual as he checked the cinch on the saddle. "How long has he been gone?" 7 years, Jane said, watching the horse's ears flick nervously. "Rattlesnake got him. I am sorry, that is a hard way to lose someone." It was fast, at least. He did not suffer long. Ethan nodded, then looked at her directly. "And you have been running this place alone ever since?" "Yes." "That is impressive. Most people would not have lasted a year." Jane shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I did not have a choice. This is my home. I was not going to let anyone take it from me. Still, it takes strength, what you have done." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They worked in silence for a while longer, and then Ethan cleared his throat. "Can I ask you something?" "I suppose." "Why do you do it? Why put yourself through this when you could sell out, move back to civilization, have an easier life?" Jane considered the question, trying to put into words something she had never really examined. "Because this is mine," she said finally. "Thomas and I built it together, and after he died, it was all I had left of him. If I had sold out, given up, it would have been like losing him all over again. So I stayed. And after a while, it stopped being about Thomas and started being about me, about proving that I could do it, that I was strong enough. Does that make sense?" "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "Yes, it does." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. Jane felt her breath catch, felt the weight of his gaze on her. For a moment she thought he might say something more, might cross the invisible line that separated employer from something else. But then one of the other hands called out needing help with something, and the moment passed. That night Jane lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She was being foolish, she told herself. Ethan was an employee, nothing more. He would be gone after the drive, moving on to the next job, the next town. Cowboys were not known for putting down roots. Getting attached would only lead to heartache, and she had already had more than her share of that. But her heart was not listening to logic. The day of the drive arrived sooner than Jane expected. She woke before dawn to find Ethan already up, saddling horses and organizing gear. The other two hands, boys really named Miguel and Billy, were moving around nervously, excited, and scared in equal measure. This was their first real cattle drive, and they were trying hard to look experienced. Jane checked her supplies one final time, making sure they had everything they needed: food, water, medical supplies, ammunition, rope, tools. It was impossible to prepare for every contingency, but she had learned to plan for the most likely problems. The route to San Antonio was well traveled, but that did not make it safe. There were rivers to cross and rough country to navigate, and always the possibility of rustlers or stampedes or simple bad luck. "Ready?" Ethan asked, appearing at her elbow. "As I will ever be," Jane replied. They moved the herd out just as the sun was rising. 200 head of cattle flowing across the land like a river of hide and horn. Jane rode point, guiding them north, while Ethan took the rear and the boys worked the sides. The cattle were restless at first, confused by the change in routine, but they settled down after the first few miles. The work was hard and constant. They pushed the herd 15 miles the first day, stopping at a creek Jane knew had good water and grass. While the cattle grazed and drank, the humans made camp. Jane cooked beans and bacon over an open fire while the men tended to the horses and set up the watch rotation. Someone needed to be awake at all times, keeping an eye on the herd, making sure they did not drift or scatter. "You take first watch," Ethan said to Miguel. "Billy, you take second. I will take third, and Jane, you take fourth if that works for you." Jane nodded. She was exhausted already, her body aching from a full day in the saddle. But this was just the beginning. They had at least a week ahead of them, probably more. She forced herself to eat, knowing she needed the energy, then rolled out her bedding near the fire. The ground was hard and cold, but she was too tired to care. She fell asleep to the sound of cattle lowing and the crackle of the fire, and dreamed of nothing at all. The second day was harder than the first. Her muscles had stiffened overnight, and every movement was painful. But she gritted her teeth and climbed back into the saddle because there was no other choice. The cattle needed to keep moving, and she needed to keep them moving. They covered another 15 miles, crossing a shallow river that made the cattle nervous but caused no real problems. That night, after dinner, Ethan sat down beside her at the fire. The boys were already asleep, exhausted by the long day, and the night was quiet except for the sounds of the herd settling down. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I am fine," Jane said automatically. "You are allowed to be tired, you know. This is hard work." "I have done it before." "I know, but that does not make it easy." Jane looked at him, at the firelight playing across his features, and felt something loosen in her chest. "It is easier with help," she admitted. "I will not lie, I was worried about doing this alone." "You do not have to do things alone anymore," Ethan said quietly. "Not if you do not want to." There was something in his voice, a weight to the words that suggested he was talking about more than just the cattle drive. Jane's heart started beating faster. She wanted to ask him what he meant, wanted to know if he was feeling the same confusing tangle of emotions that she was. But fear held her back. The fear of being vulnerable, of risking her heart after so many years of keeping it locked away. "I should get some sleep," she said instead, standing up quickly. "Long day tomorrow." If Ethan was disappointed by her retreat, he did not show it. "Good night, Jane." "Good night." She lay in her bedroll and stared up at the stars, feeling like a coward. But the truth was she was scared. Scared of what she was feeling, scared of what might happen if she let herself care about someone again. It was safer to keep her distance, to maintain the walls she had built so carefully over the years. But safe was starting to feel an awful lot like lonely. The drive continued, each day blending into the next. They made steady progress, covering 15 to 20 miles a day, the herd moving well. There were small problems: a cow with an injured hoof, a rattlesnake that spooked the horses, a brief afternoon thunderstorm that had everyone scrambling for rain gear, but nothing major, nothing they could not handle. And every day, Jane found herself more drawn to Ethan, the way he handled problems with calm efficiency, the way he treated the younger hands with respect, teaching them without talking down to them, the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, his eyes soft with something that might have been longing. They were 5 days into the drive when trouble found them. Jane was riding drag, eating dust at the back of the herd when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. She turned in her saddle and saw 3 riders coming up behind them, pushing their horses hard. Her hand went instinctively to her rifle, every instinct screaming danger. "Ethan!" she called out, her voice sharp with warning. He was beside her in moments, his own rifle already in his hands. Miguel and Billy circled back, looking nervous. The 3 riders slowed as they approached, spreading out in a way that was clearly meant to be threatening. They were rough-looking men, unshaven and dirty, with hard eyes and harder faces. "Afternoon," the leader said, his voice falsely friendly. "That's a nice herd you have got there." "It is my herd," Jane said, keeping her voice steady, "and we are not looking for company. Now that is not very neighborly. We have just been admiring your cattle, thinking maybe you could spare a few, seeing as you have so many. Nothing is for sale. Move along." The leader's false smile dropped. "I do not think you understand the situation, lady. We are not asking." Ethan shifted his horse slightly, putting himself between Jane and the rustlers. "You need to leave," he said, his voice flat and cold, "right now." "Or what? There are 3 of us and 4 of you, but 2 of yours are just boys. I like our odds." "You are forgetting one thing," Ethan said. "We are protecting what is ours. You are just thieves. That makes us a lot more motivated." For a long moment, the 2 groups stared at each other, tension crackling in the air like lightning. Jane's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst, but she kept her rifle steady, kept her face calm. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let anyone steal from her now. Finally, the leader spat into the dust. "This is not over," he said. "We will be seeing you again." They wheeled their horses and rode off, disappearing into the distance. Jane let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her hands shaking with adrenaline. "Everyone all right?" Ethan asked, his eyes scanning the group. "Yes," Jane managed. "Miguel, Billy?" "We are good," Miguel said, though his voice was shaky. "We need to keep moving," Ethan said. "And we need to be extra careful tonight. They might come back after dark, try to stampede the herd or steal cattle while we are sleeping." They pushed the herd hard for the rest of the day, trying to put distance between themselves and the rustlers. That night, they made camp in a defensible position with their backs to a rock outcropping. Ethan doubled the watch, and they all slept with their weapons close at hand. Jane was on 3rd watch, sitting with her rifle across her lap and her eyes on the darkness, when Ethan emerged from his bedroll and came to sit beside her. "Could not sleep?" she asked quietly. "Wanted to make sure you were all right. That was a close call today." "I have dealt with rustlers before. It comes with the territory." "Does not make it any less scary." Jane looked at him, surprised by the admission. "You were scared?" "Terrified," Ethan said frankly. "Not for myself, but for you. The thought of something happening to you, of not being able to protect you." He shook his head. "I've never felt that kind of fear before." Her breath caught. "Ethan?" "I know I am just a hired hand," he said, his voice low and intense. I know I have no right to feel the way I do, but Jane, these past few weeks working beside you, watching you fight for your dreams, I have come to care about you more than I should, more than is probably wise. I care about you too, Jane whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside her. I have been trying not to, trying to keep my distance, but I can't. Every day I find myself looking for you, wanting to be near you. It scares me. Why does it scare you? Because I lost Thomas, and it nearly destroyed me. I do not know if I can survive that kind of pain again. Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused, familiar in a way that made her heart ache. I cannot promise I will never leave you, he said. Nobody can promise that, but I can promise that I'm not going anywhere by choice. I can promise that if you give me a chance, I will spend every day trying to make you happy. Tears pricked at Jane's eyes. She had been alone for so long, had convinced herself she did not need anyone. But the truth was she was tired of being alone, tired of fighting every battle by herself. And here was this man, this good man, offering to stand beside her. You do not have to do this alone anymore, Ethan said, echoing words he had spoken before. But this time, she understood what he was really saying. This time she was ready to hear it. I want to believe that, Jane said. I want to believe you will stay. Then believe it. Trust me, Jane. Trust this. He leaned in slowly, and Jane met him halfway. Their lips touched, gentle at first, tentative, then deeper with 7 years of loneliness and longing behind it. Jane felt something inside her crack open, something she had kept locked away for so long. When they finally pulled apart, she was breathing hard, her heart racing. We should probably focus on the watch, she said, but she did not let go of his hand. Probably, yes, Ethan agreed, but he was smiling. They sat together in the darkness, hands linked, watching over the herd. And for the first time in 7 years, Jane did not feel alone. The rustlers did not return that night or the next, but the threat of them kept everyone on edge. They pushed hard, trying to reach San Antonio as quickly as possible. The cattle were tired, and so were the people, but they kept moving. 3 days later, they reached the outskirts of San Antonio. The city sprawled before them, bigger and more bustling than anything Jane had seen in years. The railhead was on the north side, a maze of pens and chutes where cattle from all over Texas were gathered for shipment east. They penned their herd, and Jane went to meet with the buyers. The negotiations were tense, with the buyers trying to lowball her and Jane fighting for every cent. But she had done this before, knew the tricks and the pressure tactics, and she held firm. Finally, after hours of back and forth, they settled on a price that was not great but was fair, enough to keep the ranch going for another year, enough to pay her hands and buy supplies and maybe, just maybe, have a little left over. She paid Miguel and Billy their wages plus a generous bonus, thanking them for their hard work. They headed off into the city, eager to spend their earnings and celebrate. That left just her and Ethan standing in the chaos of the stockyards. I suppose this is where we part ways, Jane said, trying to keep her voice neutral. They had not talked about what came next, had been too focused on the drive to think beyond it. But now that it was over, reality was setting in. Ethan had signed on for the drive, nothing more. He was free to move on, to find another job, another place. And why would he want to stay on a struggling ranch with a woman who was barely making ends meet? Is that what you want? Ethan asked, his blue eyes serious. No, Jane said, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. No, that is not what I want at all. Then I am not going anywhere. If you will have me, I would like to stay. Work your ranch, help you build it into something great. Be beside you, Jane, for as long as you will let me. Relief flooded through her, so intense it was almost painful. The pay is terrible, she warned. The work is endless, and I am not easy to live with. I do not care about the pay. I do not mind the work. And I happen to think you are perfect just as you are." Jane laughed, a sound that was half joy and half tears. "You are crazy." "Probably. Is that a yes?" "Yes," Jane said. "Yes, stay. Please stay." He pulled her into his arms right there in the middle of the stockyard, surrounded by cattle and cowboys and chaos, and kissed her. And Jane kissed him back, pouring 7 years of loneliness and longing into it, feeling the walls around her heart finally, completely crumble. They spent that night in a hotel in San Antonio, in a real bed with clean sheets, and Jane marveled at the luxury of it. But more than that, she marveled at the man beside her, at the warmth of his body and the steadiness of his presence. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and dreams, learning each other in ways that went beyond the physical. "Tell me about your family," Jane asked, her head resting on his chest. "Not much to tell," Ethan said. "My parents died when I was young. Fever took them both within a week of each other. I was raised by my uncle, learned ranching from him. He was a hard man, but fair. When he died, I started drifting, worked different places, never stayed long. I think I was looking for something, but I did not know what. And now? Now I think I have found it." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "What about you? You said your father wanted you to come back to St. Louis?" "Yes. He never approved of Thomas, thought I was throwing my life away by marrying a rancher. When Thomas died, my father saw it as proof that he had been right. He has been begging me to come home ever since." "Are you close to him?" "Not really. We have not seen eye to eye on much of anything since I was a girl. He wanted me to be something I was not. Soft and delicate and proper, I wanted to run and climb trees and ride horses. We have been disappointing each other for as long as I can remember." "His loss," Ethan said firmly. "You are extraordinary, Jane Sullivan. I hope someday he realizes that." Jane felt tears prick her eyes again. She had spent so long believing she was not enough, that she was too hard, too stubborn, too unfeminine. But Ethan saw her differently. He saw her strength as something to admire, not something to fix, and that made all the difference. They returned to the ranch a week later, taking their time on the journey back. Without the herd to manage, the trip was easier, almost pleasant. They rode side by side, talking and laughing, and Jane felt lighter than she had in years. The burden she had been carrying alone was now shared, and it made everything feel possible. Back at the ranch, they fell into a new rhythm. Ethan moved his things from the bunkhouse into the main house, and they began to build a life together. He was true to his word, working tirelessly to help her improve the ranch. They repaired buildings and dug new wells, expanded the herd, and broke new horses. And every night they came together in the house Thomas had built, creating new memories to overlay the old ones. 3 months after the cattle drive, on a warm evening in July, Ethan asked Jane to marry him. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the land they now tended together, and he took her hand in his. "I know it has not been that long," he said, "but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Jane. I want to build a life with you, a real life. Will you marry me?" Jane looked at him, at this man who had appeared when she needed him most, who had seen her at her worst and loved her anyway, and felt her heart swell with certainty. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married a month later in the small church in Del Rio. It was a simple ceremony with just a few friends and neighbors in attendance. Jane wore a simple blue dress, and Ethan wore his best shirt and a nervous smile. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her with such tenderness that Jane felt tears slide down her cheeks. At the reception, held at the ranch, Tom Fletcher came up to congratulate them. "I have to admit, Jane, I did not think you would ever find someone willing to take on this place, and you," he said with a grin, "but it looks like Ethan here is up to the challenge." "She is worth it," Ethan said simply, his arm around Jane's waist. "That she is," Tom agreed. "You have got yourself a good one, Marshall. Do not let her get away." "I do not plan to." As the sun set and the party continued, Jane stood with her new husband and looked out over the land she had fought so hard to keep. For 7 years, she had done it alone, had proved to everyone, including herself, that she was strong enough. But now, with Ethan beside her, she realized that strength was not just about enduring alone. It was also about being brave enough to accept help, to let someone in, to build something together. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan looked at her, puzzled. "For what?" "For telling me I did not have to do it alone anymore. For meaning it." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You never have to be alone again," he promised. "I am here, Jane. For as long as you will have me, I am here." The first year of their marriage was not easy. There were still struggles, still setbacks. A late frost killed some of their calves, and a dry summer meant they had to sell off part of the herd earlier than planned. But through it all, they faced it together. When Jane was discouraged, Ethan was there to lift her up. When Ethan was frustrated, Jane was there to ground him. They learned to lean on each other, to trust each other, to be a team. The ranch began to thrive in ways it never had before. With 2 people working at full time, they were able to expand and improve. They built new corrals and a larger barn. They brought in better breeding stock and improved their herd. They planted a garden and repaired the house, making it truly theirs. And in the spring of 1886, 2 years after Ethan had first ridden up to her ranch, Jane discovered she was pregnant. She was terrified at first. Childbirth was dangerous, especially out here far from doctors and hospitals, but Ethan was overjoyed, his face lighting up with wonder when she told him. He became even more protective, insisting she take it easy, doing the harder work himself. Jane tried to protest, tried to maintain her independence, but the truth was it felt good to be cared for. It felt good to not have to be strong all the time. Their son was born in December during a cold snap that had them huddled around the fire. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Jane was sure she would not survive it. But the midwife from town was skilled and calm, and Ethan held her hand through it all, whispering encouragement and love. When their baby finally arrived, red-faced and wailing, Jane felt a surge of love so fierce it took her breath away. They named him Thomas, after the man who had first built this ranch, who had given Jane her start even if he had not lived to see it through. Little Thomas had his father's blue eyes and his mother's stubborn determination, and from the moment he arrived, he owned their hearts completely. Life shifted again with a baby in the house. The work did not stop, but it was punctuated now by feedings and diaper changes, by late nights rocking a fussy infant, and early mornings with a curious toddler. Jane marveled at how her life had changed, how she had gone from alone and struggling to surrounded by love and still struggling, but in a completely different way. "Do you ever miss it?" Ethan asked one night as they watched Thomas sleep in his cradle. "The way things were before, when you did not have to worry about anyone but yourself?" "No," Jane said without hesitation. "I was surviving before, but I was not living. Now I am living." Ethan smiled and pulled her close. "Me too." As Thomas grew, he became a fixture on the ranch, toddling after his father, trying to help with chores he was far too small to manage. Ethan was patient with him, teaching him about animals and land with the same gentle competence he had shown Jane. Watching them together, Jane felt her heart swell with gratitude for the life they had built. The ranch continued to grow. They hired seasonal help when they needed it, but for the most part, it was just the 3 of them, and later, when their daughter Emma arrived 2 years after Thomas, the 4 of them. Emma was all fire and determination, running as soon as she could walk, climbing anything that would hold still long enough. She reminded Jane of herself at that age, and she loved her daughter with a fierceness that sometimes scared her. Years passed in a blur of seasons and celebrations, of hard work and harder winters, of good years and lean years. But through it all, Jane and Ethan stood together. They argued sometimes, both of them too stubborn for their own good, but they always made up. They learned each other's rhythms, learned how to work together so seamlessly it was like they were two halves of the same whole. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they stood on the porch of their house, the house that had been Thomas's and was now theirs, and looked out over their land. The ranch had grown beyond anything Jane had imagined possible when she was doing it alone. They ran 500 head of cattle now, had hired on 2 permanent hands to help with the work, had built a legacy that would sustain their children and their children's children. "Do you remember that first day you rode up here?" Jane asked, leaning against her husband, "when I hired you for the drive? I remember thinking you were the most stubborn, beautiful, terrifying woman I had ever met," Ethan said with a laugh. "I also remember thinking I would do just about anything to stay near you. And here you are 10 years later. Here I am, and I would not want to be anywhere else." Jane turned to look at him, at the man who had changed her life so completely. There was gray in his hair now, lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but he was still the same man who had looked at her and seen not a woman who needed fixing, but a woman worth standing beside. "I love you," she said. "I do not say it enough, but I do. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love someone." "I love you too," Ethan said, kissing her softly. "You are my home, Jane. You and the kids and this ranch, this is everything I ever wanted." Thomas came running around the corner of the house then, now 8 years old and full of energy, with Emma close behind him. They were arguing about something, as siblings do, but they stopped when they saw their parents. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked. "It's just talking," Jane said, opening her arms. Both children ran to her, and she gathered them close, feeling Ethan's arms come around all of them. This was her life now. Not the lonely struggle she had endured for 7 years, but this. A family, a partnership, a love that had grown from a chance meeting into something unbreakable. She had spent so long believing she had to do everything alone, had to prove her strength by refusing help. But she had learned that true strength was knowing when to let people in, when to share the burden, when to build something together that was greater than anything she could have created alone. The sun was setting over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The cattle lowed in the distance, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The wind carried the smell of grass and dust, of home. "Come on," Ethan said, releasing them all with one final squeeze. "Let's get inside. Your mother made her famous peach cobbler, and I will be damned if I'm going to let it get cold." The children whooped and ran ahead, and Jane and Ethan followed at a slower pace, hands linked. As they walked, Jane thought about the girl she had been, 19 and newly widowed, staring down a future that seemed impossibly hard. She thought about the woman she had become, forged by struggle and hardship into something stronger than she had known she could be. But most of all, she thought about the man beside her, the cowboy who had ridden into her life when she needed him most, and said the words that had changed everything. "You do not have to do it alone anymore." And she had not. They had built this life together, brick by brick, day by day, through good times and bad. They had created something worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth passing on to the next generation. Inside, the house was warm and bright, filled with the laughter of children and the smell of food cooking. Jane stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in, memorizing this moment of perfect contentment. Then Ethan took her hand and pulled her inside, into the warmth, into the light, into the life they had made together. Years continued to unfold like the pages of a well-loved book. Thomas grew into a serious young man who loved the land as much as his parents did, who could ride and rope with the best of them by the time he was 12. Emma remained wild and free, but with a mind as sharp as any boy's and a determination that Jane recognized in herself. She refused to be left behind, insisted on learning everything her brother learned, and Ethan taught them both with equal patience and pride. When Thomas was 15 and Emma was 13, Jane found herself pregnant again. It was a surprise, as she had thought her childbearing years were behind her, But this baby, another son they named William, was a joy nonetheless. He was an easy baby, quick to laugh and slow to fuss, and his older siblings doted on him endlessly. The ranch continued to prosper. They had weathered droughts and storms, market fluctuations, and cattle diseases, but they always came through. It helped that they had built a reputation for quality, for cattle that were well-bred and well-tended. Buyers sought them out now rather than the other way around, and they were able to command good prices. With the additional income, they made improvements to the house. They added on 2 more rooms, expanded the porch, installed glass windows from back east that let in light but kept out the wind. It was still the same house Thomas had built, but it had grown and changed, just like the family that lived in it. On quiet evenings after the children were in bed and the work was done, Jane and Ethan would sit on that expanded porch and watch the stars. Sometimes they talked, sharing thoughts and dreams and memories. Other times they just sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, content in each other's presence. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you had sold out?" Ethan asked one such evening. "If you had gone back to St. Louis like your father wanted?" Jane considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I cannot imagine it, not really. That person, the one who would have given up and gone back, she is not me. Maybe she never was." "I am glad," Ethan said, "because if you had sold out, I never would have found you. And that is a world I do not want to imagine. Me either." They sat in silence for a while longer, and then Ethan spoke again. "I got a letter from Tom Fletcher today. He is thinking about retiring, selling his ranch. He wanted to know if we would be interested in buying him out, combining the spreads." Jane sat up straighter, her mind immediately running through the possibilities. Tom's ranch bordered theirs to the east, another 3,000 acres of good grazing land. Combined, they would have one of the largest operations in the area, but it would also mean taking on significant debt, stretching themselves thin. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think it is a big risk," Ethan said honestly, "but I also think we could make it work. Thomas is old enough to take on more responsibility, and Emma is nearly as capable. With their help, we could manage it." "We would need to hire more hands." "Yes, but we could afford it, especially if the prices stay good." Jane thought about it, weighing the risks and rewards. 7 years ago, she would have said no immediately, would have been too scared to take the chance, but she was not that woman anymore. She had learned that sometimes you had to take risks to build something great. "All right," she said, "well, let's do it." Ethan grinned. "Really?" "Really, let's buy Tom's ranch and see how big we can make this thing." The expansion was both thrilling and terrifying. They negotiated with Tom, settling on a price that was fair, but still required them to take out a loan from the bank. Jane hated being in debt, hated the feeling of not having solid ground under her feet, but Ethan was confident they could make it work. They hired on 4 more permanent hands and several seasonal workers. Thomas, now 16, stepped up to help manage them, showing a natural leadership ability that made both his parents proud. Emma, 14, took over much of the bookkeeping and record-keeping, her sharp mind perfect for tracking expenses and income. The first year was brutal. Managing twice the land and twice the herd was harder than they'd anticipated. There were days when Jane was so exhausted she could barely move, when she wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. But Ethan was always there, steady and sure, reminding her that they had overcome worse. And slowly, gradually, it started to work. The cattle thrived on the additional grazing land. The prices held steady. They paid down their debt faster than expected. By the end of the second year, Jane could breathe easier, could see that they had made the right choice. On a warm spring day, when the wildflowers were blooming across the prairie and the sky was impossibly blue, Jane rode out to the far edge of their property. She sat on her horse and looked out over the land, all 6,000 acres of it, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was hers and Ethan's, built from nothing but determination and hard work and love. She had started with 3,000 acres and a broken heart, and she had turned it into something magnificent. Pretty impressive, is it not? She turned to find Ethan riding up beside her, William perched in front of him in the saddle. The boy was 5 now, already fascinated by horses and cattle, already begging to help with the ranch work. "It is," Jane agreed. "Sometimes I still cannot believe it is real." "It is real," Ethan said. "You made it real. We made it real." William squirmed, eager to get down and explore. Ethan lifted him carefully to the ground and watched as he ran off to examine some interesting rocks. "He is going to be a handful," Ethan said with a laugh. "Just like his parents," Jane replied. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their son play, watching the cattle graze in the distance. This was what happiness looked like, Jane thought. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of people worth struggling with. Not the elimination of hard work, but work that had meaning and purpose. "I never thanked you properly," Jane said suddenly. "For what?" "For that first day when you told me I did not have to do it alone anymore. For staying when you could have left. For loving me when I was too stubborn and scared to love you back right away. For building this life with me." Ethan reached over and took her hand. "Jane, loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "I would too." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they called William back and rode together toward home. The house was visible in the distance, solid and enduring, smoke rising from the chimney where Emma was likely cooking lunch. Thomas would be out with the hands checking the herd, doing the work that would someday make this ranch his to run. This was her legacy, Jane thought. Not just the land and the cattle, but the family she had built. The love she had found when she had least expected it. The life she had created from the ashes of loss and loneliness. She had raised cattle alone for 7 hard years, proving to the world and to herself that she was strong enough, capable enough, determined enough. And then a cowboy had ridden into her life and told her she did not have to anymore. And in letting him in letting him help, in letting herself love and be loved, she had found something far greater than she had ever imagined possible. Years turned into decades, and the ranch continued to thrive under their stewardship. Thomas married a smart, capable woman named Sarah, and they gave Jane and Ethan 3 grandchildren. Emma, true to her independent nature, took longer to settle down, but eventually married a school teacher from town and moved to San Antonio, though she visited often and still kept the ranch's books. William grew up wild and free, learning the land from his parents just as his siblings had. When he was 18, he announced his intention to become a veterinarian, wanting to combine his love of animals with more formal education. Jane and Ethan supported his decision, proud of his ambition, and he went off to school in Austin. As they grew older, Jane and Ethan gradually turned over more of the daily operations to Thomas and Sarah. It was hard at first, letting go of the control Jane had maintained for so long, but she trusted her son, trusted that he would care for the land as she had, and it was time. She and Ethan spent their later years in the house they had shared for so long, surrounded by memories and love. They took long rides across their land, just the 2 of them, reminiscing about the early days when it had been just Jane alone, fighting to survive. "Do you have any regrets?" Ethan asked her once, when they were both in their 60s, sitting on the porch and watching the sunset. Jane thought about it carefully. "Not about this," she said finally. "Not about us, or the ranch, or the life we built. There were hard times when I thought we would not make it, but I would not change any of it." "Not even those first 7 years?" Ethan asked gently. "When you were alone?" "Not even those," Jane said, "because they made me who I am. They taught me I was strong enough to survive anything, and that made me brave enough to let you in when you showed up. If I had not gone through all of that, I might not have been ready for you." Ethan nodded, understanding. "I am glad I found you when I did," he said. "I am glad you took a chance on a drifter looking for work." "Best decision I ever made," Jane said, leaning against him. "Well, second best. First was deciding not to sell out." He laughed. the sound warm and familiar. Fair enough. They grew old together, their bodies slowing but their minds still sharp, their love still strong. They became fixtures in Del Rio, respected elders who had built something lasting. People came to them for advice on ranching, on marriage, on life, and Jane and Ethan shared what they had learned, hoping it might help others the way they had helped each other. When Jane was 72, she fell ill with pneumonia. It came on suddenly, leaving her weak and struggling to breathe. The doctor came from town, did what he could, but they all knew the truth. At her age, recovery was uncertain. Ethan never left her side. He sat by her bed day and night, holding her hand, talking to her, reading to her from her favorite books. The children came, and the grandchildren, filling the house with life and noise. But in the quiet moments, it was just the two of them, as it had always been. "I am not ready to leave you," Jane whispered one night when the house was finally quiet. "I know," Ethan said, his voice thick with tears. "But if you need to go, if you're tired, it is all right. I will be fine. The kids will be fine. You have built something that will last forever, Jane." "Promise me something," she said, gripping his hand with what strength she had left. "Anything. Promise me you will be happy. After I am gone, promise me you will not just exist. The ranch will be fine without us. Let Thomas have it. Travel, see the places you always wanted to see. Live, Ethan. Really live." "I will try," he promised, though they both knew it would be hard. But Jane was stronger than the illness. She fought it with the same stubborn determination she had shown in everything else. And slowly, gradually, she recovered. It took months, and she never quite got back to full strength, but she survived. "You could not even die easy," Ethan teased her when she was finally up and moving around again. "Had to fight your way out of that too." "I was not done yet," Jane said simply. "I still have things to do." And she did. For several more years, she and Ethan continued their life together, slowing down but still present, still engaged. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, in the house that had witnessed so much of their lives. When Jane finally passed, it was peacefully in her sleep, with Ethan beside her. She was 78 years old, and she had lived a full and remarkable life. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, from family to friends to business associates to people whose lives she had touched in ways large and small. Ethan stood at her grave and remembered the day he had first seen her, standing in her barn with dust on her clothes and determination in her eyes. He remembered the feel of her hand in his, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her love, and he made good on his promise. He traveled, visiting William in his veterinary practice, spending time with Emma and her family, helping Thomas and Sarah with the ranch when they needed it. But mostly, he remembered. And he was grateful. Grateful for the years they had shared, for the love they had built, for the life they had created together. 2 years after Jane's death, Ethan followed her. He went peacefully, sitting in his favorite chair on the porch, looking out over the land they had tended together. His children found him there, and they knew immediately that he had gone to be with his Jane. They buried him beside her on a hill overlooking the ranch. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew across the prairie and the cattle lowed in the distance, people swore they could feel their presence still, watching over the land they had loved so well. The ranch continued, passed down through generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story. But the foundation remained, built by a woman who had refused to give up and a man who had taught her she did not have to face everything alone. It was a legacy of love and determination, of hard work and stubborn hope. And it endured, just as their love had endured through all the years and all the changes, a testament to what two people could build when they stood together. The story of Jane Sullivan and Ethan Marshall became legend in Del Rio, told and retold over the years. The woman who had raised cattle alone for 7 hard years, and the cowboy who had told her she did not have to anymore. It was a love story, yes, but it was also a story about strength and courage, about building something lasting, about finding partnership in unexpected places. And on the hill where they were buried, wildflowers grew every spring, painting the ground in brilliant colors as enduring and beautiful as the love they had shared